You just said something about one poet. I didn't quite catch the name, Suhyun, about somebody writing about transgender characters. Could you just expand on who that was? I didn't quite catch it. You said it very fast.
Yeah, 최호기. He's
Chehoki.
yeah, I featured him in Nabulera as well, and Hwang Byung-sung also wrote a about a transgender person, although he's not a transgender. So those poems exist also by like anonymous poets who use pseudonyms. There are poems like that. So that's why I said it's not the first queer poetry, but like openly, gay, like openly queer poetry by an openly gay poet. I think that might be the first work.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I remember reading something recently about somebody reading Isang's poetry through a queer lens, and they were that, and I'm not sure if that was anachronistic or projecting, but it makes sense what you're saying, that this is the first openly queer one. Does that say something about Korean society in general? So before we get into that, I mean, South Korea is definitely changing in the last 10, 20 years. Things are becoming more progressive, like storylines in dramas and things like that, and now featuring these a little bit more. Perhaps for the people that don't live or work in Korea, can you give us some kind of that context or how you see this? Is it still really conservative? Is it changing? Is it becoming more embracing? Or
That's a really hard question. I think it is changing. It's definitely changing. I want to mention this later when I'm talking about Kim Hyun, but he was born in 1980, and just imagine him growing up in the 1980s and 90s in Korea. I think the first openly gay and transgender people in Korea were like in early 2000s. Like when I was growing up, Harisu came out in 2000 or 2001, and Hong Seok-chan came out in 2000. And they were not positively received. Harisu was a little better, but it was more like people were amazed that she looks like a woman. I mean, she's a woman, but that's what people said. But Hong Seok-chan, he kind of had to step down from everything. So he was gone for so many years. But even so, at least when I was growing up, I knew that there are those people. They are not okay, but there are those people. Gay and transgender people, and having that kind of word, having that kind of figure, I think it was drastically different from gay or lesbian or transgender culture being underground and teenagers growing up and not knowing about it. And now I think it is more actively discussed, which means that there are more backlashes too. But there are organizations like Ding Dong, which is an LGBT organization for teenagers, which didn't exist when I was a teenager. So I think things are changing, and I think with the Christianity, Christian population in Korea, there are fundamentalists who feels strongly against it, but I don't think otherwise people really have the faith to go against homosexuality or transgenders. People might think that those people are not a traditionally Korean. It's not our tradition. It's a Western thing. But at the same time, traditions change. Even the concept of unnatural is fake, right? What is natural, what is nature, and what is human nature, and what is artificial? Where do we draw the line between them? So it is easier to persuade people or have a conversation with people, even if they have prejudice against the gay people or transgender people. It's not as strong as them thinking that being gay or trans is a sin. Sin is something transcendental. They are given by the God, and it's unchangeable. It doesn't change just because the society changes. So I see a lot of I don't know how to say it. I think it's complicated. I think I'll just put it that way. Yeah.
it is absolutely very complicated, and when you talk about Korean culture, these kind of things, I mean, Korea culture today is very different from what it was 10 years ago. It's changing all the time. It's not a static entity, or this kind of transcendental thing, as you were describing it that way. It's always moving. And there's this one idea, Suhyun, that I've explored often you mentioned that Kim Hyun, who we'll be talking about today, born in 1980, would have grown up without that representation, without those figures in the media. When I grew up in the United Kingdom, it was George Michael, Elton John, Freddie Mercury, Samantha Fox, or Ian McKellen, Stephen Fry. And so it was just kind of natural for me. I never had to rationalize my attitudes towards it. It was kind of a natural thing. And so I guess now that's why Korea is changing, because people, your generation and younger, they're growing up with that. That does seem to be a good thing, that representation. And I guess that's why Kim Hyun's collection is another step there. Now, it's described as queer poetry. Now, I don't know if this is going to be like a technical term, or is queer poetry a genre? Is it poetry that explores the nature of being queer, or is it just poetry written by queer people? Can straight people write queer poetry? What is queer poetry, Suhyun?
Some people might disagree, but I just think of it as more of a character description, right? Just a descriptive word. It's not a genre. There's no gatekeeping here. Poems that explore identities, experiences, or emotions that do not conform to the traditional concept of gender and sexuality, I think we can describe them as queer. It doesn't have to be like you actively identify as gay person. I mean, there are straight people who explore with their feelings, that are not like heterosexual. There are those people, and I think everything counts, really. It's just like, how we call, I guess, soft and moist stuff like squishy. It's just like that. It's just a word you describe the work. So yeah, that's what I think about it.
So it's not a genre, and I think that's where things are going, more on spectrums rather than this kind of this or that, this binary, but it's more spectrum. Okay, so that's kind of queer poetry. Now, when I read through this collection of 51 poems called Glory Hole from Kim Hyun, I'm married, I have a wife, and I'm straight, but I still loved it. I mean, I also grew up, I've read Burroughs, and I've read Genet's Our Lady of the Flowers, and all of these things, but I was able to take a lot from it. Now, in terms of identity these days, Suhyun, there's been a lot of conversation about certain people should play certain roles in movies. In Korean television, there was Uri de le Blues, Our Blues, and there was, for the first time, a disabled person playing a disabled role. And so that idea of, authentic representation is important. How did identity come into the translation of this work? So if you're translating queer poetry, do you have to have a certain understanding of the queer lifestyle? Does identity matter, or does art just transcend that, and creativity and empathy plays the biggest factor in this? I
think empathy plays the biggest factor in this, but I think it depends on a specific work, right? For Glory Hole, the references can make it's foreign, fantastical. We know Andy Warhol is gay. You don't need to be gay to know that. Right. But there might be some works that refer to specific slangs or underground culture that is specific to a certain city or a country. And if you're not a part of them, you might not get the meaning. You might not get the references. In that case, I think it's definitely necessary for you to be a part of those people. But for Glory Hole, I don't think it is necessary. I think what's more important is you sharing the feeling that is embedded in the poems, knowing how it is to be excluded, feeling excluded, or feeling different, being confused about yourself. And if you can connect your experience to Kim's experience in these poems, if you can channel it to it, I think it's gonna work. If you're queer, I think it's gonna help, but I don't think it is necessary.
When you say if you're queer, it would help, because I think maybe that's what sometimes might make it queer literature, because the use of certain terms, or the use of certain, whether it's language, whether it's idioms that I identify it as that thing. I remember reading through some of them and going, there was one that stuck with me, like peanut butter is a use for a certain thing. I can't remember what it was now. Can you remember what peanut butter was used to?
I remember actually.
Okay, it was pretty
Yeah.
fluid and graphic, as a lot of the
Mm,
work was, but
mm.
you, there's a lot of that in there. And so you think empathy is the most important thing, and this idea of understanding this concept of being ostracized or outside, is that what this work is it a work of understanding those who sit outside mainstream society?
I don't think it's the work is about, you know, those people, but those are the, what is that, the fundamentals that builds up the whole poetry collection.
Mm,
Given the, I just like describe the circumstance Kim Hyun would have grown up, and the fact that there is so much destruction, and those experiences can be explained only through, um, just defying conventions and destroying things. I think it is a crucial part of it. But I
mm.
don't want readers to like read the poetry collection thinking, oh, I should understand, who's excluded here, and I should figure that out. That is not the main project, but you should be mindful about it.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe it's not didactic. It's not forcing a message or a thing on people, but
Right.
sometimes, like Andy Warhol stuff, it's just art for art's
Mhm.
sake, and it is that.
Yeah.
You mentioned sort of Kim Hyun a couple of times now. Perhaps let's turn the conversation to him. And so you said he was born in 1980. I watched an interview he was given, or rather a conversation with Hwang In-tan, two poets talking together, and just from the conversation I listened to them speaking in Korean, Kim Hyun seemed very humorous, soft-spoken, kind of, cool guy. Have you met him? Did you talk with
Yeah.
him during this? Can you tell us anything
Mhm.
about Kim Hyun, the person, Suhyun?
Yeah. I think your impression is exactly right. I met him at the Changbi Cafe. It's the cafe in the video you watched,
Okay.
with Hwang In-chan and
Mm.
Kim Hyun. But yeah, and we had lunch together after that. And he's a very humorous and soft-spoken person for sure, and he's very humble too. But by soft-spoken, it doesn't mean he's shy or reserved, right? He
Mm.
expresses everything he needs to express. He's one of the most vocal spurs of the Me Too movement within the Korean literary circle, and he spoke up in the literary journal called 21세기 문학, 21st Century Literature, and he has worked with the women's hotline, 여성의 전화,
Mm-hmm.
and he has also volunteered for Ding Dong, a safe space for teenagers, for a long time. So he's like very active, and he's very just there. He really wants to help people, and he's not a type of person who would hide and then write like subversive literature and that's it. But he
Mm.
does that, but he also likes to help people directly. But when he's like a challenging like people, like in those like the Me Too movements and things like that, he's still very soft spoken, I think. But that's just how he speaks, right? Yeah.
I think to do something like that in South Korea makes it even more impressive, because I sometimes find, and my perspective might be, some people might disagree with it. It's just my own opinion, but sometimes in South Korea it's hard to stand up and go against the grain, or to go against the majority opinion. People expect, or there's a value on social harmony, there's a value on the collective, there's a value on the uri sometimes, and so to stand up and go against that, I think, takes even more courage perhaps in South Korea than in other parts where we focus on this hyper individualism and speaking one's truth. But I think what he's doing here speaks to even more courage perhaps.
Yeah, I think a lot of Korean LGBT people feels pressure not to talk about it or not to be too active about LGBT movement because of their family members. Like think about your mom and dad.
Mm,
If like everyone else in the village knows that you're gay, like yeah, how are they gonna feel about it? And I think those concerns are more real, like or actively felt in Korea
mm,
than in the United States, in my experience. But yeah, it's like a Kim Hyun actually in one of the interviews, he said that a poet is somebody who sings first, like 선창, so that crowd can sing along. And I think that's exactly who he is as a person. And if people get the reference in the poem, he makes a reference to, what is that? To the 촛불 시위, candlelight demonstration
Yep.
during Park Park-geun's time. He doesn't say it explicitly, but if somebody knows the Korean culture, they would get it. So there is a lot of political element in the poem too.
That's a beautiful line, Suhyun, that you said. A poem is someone who sings. A poet is someone who sings first, so that other people can join in. That's a really nice idea. Yeah, to push art and to have those people to speak out and to push the conversation. Yeah, that's excellent. What kind of reputation? So we get an idea perhaps of his work in social and cultural and progressive movements with you said about the Yosong Chonwa, the women's helpline, and Ding Dong, and these kind of things. What about in the literary world, Kim Hyun's reputation in the literary world? Because I hear about Kim Ji-ha, who recently passed, and he was always well known. Isang, who I mentioned, Go-eun was everywhere until the scandals against him sort of, you don't hear or see about him anymore. So where does like Kim Hyun sit in the literary world conversation in South Korea?
Yeah, sure. Those people you mentioned, they are obviously old and they passed away. And yeah, Goen was like considered, the master before the scandal happened. And yeah, with those people, the similarities they share is also that their works appeared in a Korean textbook, Korean literature textbook, middle school and high school students learn. That's how people learn about those people, right? And that is not the case for most contemporary poets, especially young poets like Kim Hyun. I don't think people who do not read poetry would know Kim Hyun that well, but people who do would definitely know him. So there are so many great poets like Hwang In-chan you mentioned. I think he's the same case. He's very well established within the circle, but there aren't that many people reading poetry, to be honest. And let's face it. I don't think he has the reputation of those people whose work appear in a textbook and everyone has to read their works.
I get a lot. So many of the Korean students in my lecture classes, they hate George Orwell because they had to read him in textbooks when they were like in middle school. And I'm like, no, just read him when you're older. Then you'll get it. But as soon as you're made to read something, always hate it. Is there such thing? And also, I'm glad that you called Kim Hyun young, because I was born in 1981, so I'm also young then, if that makes sense. Is there such thing as Korean poetry? So you mentioned like these older people who are in textbooks, they're kind of gone, and there's this new contemporary thing. Now you work in literature in that field, but when I think of French poetry, I might start thinking of like existentialists and very Dadaism and that kind of thing. If I think of Russian poetry, I might think of kind of epic or bleak. These might be stereotypes that you completely disagree with, but I'm just curious, is it possible to characterize in any way? Are there any common traits? Contemporary Korean poetry, not the old dead guys, but the people that are doing stuff now.
I don't know. I really have no idea. I know a lot of young poets. They are experimental and they step out of the those definition of poems should have lines and rhymes, meters. But I don't think outside that, if they have like a specific styles or like mood they share, I don't know. I think there gotta be a better person to answer that. I'm not one of them.
No, it's fair enough. But I do think a lot of Korean poetry seems that I read, and I don't read a lot, but we both know Brother Anthony, I think, and he's always posting his translations. So
Yeah.
I read a lot of those. But Korean poetry does always seem experimental to me. There was this one thing that I could never understand Korean traditional music like pansori or sando. And I spoke to Jocelyn Clark, who is a great instrumentalist, and she explained to me that I'm listening to it wrong, and I have to listen for the beat on the 1 and the 9. So I'm Western. I'm always listening to I'm listening for the 2 and the 4. But when she explained the 1 and the 9, I was like, and I started listening to it again, and it all made sense once I got that. And so I'm always looking for that thing with Korean poetry now, or Korean literature. Do you have to understand something to get the Korean? Can non-Korean people get Korean poetry?
You see, that's like a really hard to answer for me, because I grew up Korean and I never had to, like, think about how to understand Korean poetry.
Right.
I grew up with it, so it's really hard for me to answer. Yeah.
Did you write poetry yourself? You did you?
Yeah, when I was little, I figured out I'm not really that talented. I can write a story, but poetry is a different animal. It's just, yeah. But yeah. So when I think about American poetry, these days, contemporary American poetry, they are oftentimes come from spoken words. Yeah, and they tend to be very political, not as in like a party politics, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think Korean poetry doesn't necessarily share that. There are some poems like that, but there are a lot fewer poems like that compared to American poetry. But that's also my impression on American poetry that might not be accurate. So yeah, see, I have like an impression on American poetry because I didn't grow up with it. But it's really hard to say about Korean poetry.
It's probably as diverse in so many different genres and ranges, but it's interesting to talk about. I'm sure many people will have their opinions on what Korean poetry is. Now, you translated Kim Hyun's work, and just for those that are not sure, Kim Hyun, he won the Shindong-Yup Prize for Literature, the Kim Jun-song Literary Award, so quite a big standing. He's got poems like debuted in 2009 with poems such as Blowjob. These are pretty impressive titles to to debut with. You, I mean, what's your first poem? It's called Blowjob, mate. Like, when did you first come across Kim Hyun's work?
It's actually when I was trying to feature queer literature for Nabulera. So I knew there are queer short stories and stuff like that, but I never thought about like queer poetry because, like as I said already, poetry often poetry collection doesn't have a theme. So I just searched if I can find anything, and Kim Hyun's work popped up, and I read it, and I was impressed. I was, this is the work I need to feature. This is really great. So that's how I found out about it.
And what is the work? What are the qualities of Kim Hyun's work? Because I've read through it now a couple of times and tried to do. I listened to one interview, Suhyun, where you described his work as destructive, destroying the boundaries between realities, but that providing creativity and a sense of beauty. So it's destructive, it's creative, it challenges, it addresses boundaries in society. What is it in Kim Hyun's work? Can you try to perhaps explain it to us? When you read it, you went, I want that.
Yeah, I think I had two things in mind. So the first one is about the poem itself, or poems themselves. So when you dissect the poem, like each poem, it doesn't make sense. Like Kim uses so many words in an unconventional and a creative way. It defies our reason, but that's exactly what makes Kim's work so unique, so interesting. You have to delve into it and focus on his work and every single word and trying to figure out what he's saying. And I thought that was the beauty. And also when you step back and look at the whole poetry collection, it still doesn't make sense. Some poems seem to be the continuation of the previous poems, but they're not like adjacent. So like sometimes you only realize that they are connected after you read the whole thing. So you see that there is this connection, but also the connection, but they are not as clear. And so it fluctuates, between those kind of opposite like spectrum. And that on its own, I thought was a unique experience. And the second thing I was thinking of when I said that is Kim's experience. Again, like, Kim was growing up when there was no word for gays or, transgenders, at least for teenagers and children. And so, and this poetry collection specifically is coming of age story. So I just thought about what would it be to experience one's attraction to another boy or a man as a man during that time. It's gonna be radically confusing and a destructive experience. It just destroys everything you knew about love, which is defined as man and women's love. Anyway, so I felt like actually reenacting that experience, it was a really creative work he produced. It's emphatically queer, and yeah, that's what I meant when I said like it's creative.
And yeah, it's absolutely emphatically queer, because we asked about like what is queer poetry at the start, and it's hard to describe, but if you read Kim Hyun's work, that's what it is. One of the things that I noticed most about it, and I think perhaps because a lot of the writing I do, Suhyun, and I try to write poetry sometimes and lyrics and stuff like that, a lot of it is very abstract. I get in that kind of like tolakdogin mode and all this kind of thing. But for Kim Hyun, it's so vivid. He's writing about people and characters and scenes and fluids and bodily acts. And it only might be one page or half a page, but I can see it all in my mind's eye as he describes it. He creates these, I think he has this amazing ability to bring to life, it's almost like a movie scene or something. It's almost like he's describing a movie scene with a character in there who's doing something. Do you get that idea from him, or?
Yeah, definitely. And you should also note that he refers to a lot of visual artists, and some of the poems are the titles of movies. And 동사와 소독, yeah, that is the title of a movie. So I think he is consciously making it visible, and like while making it visible, he just like pulls everything apart, in front of you. Yeah.
You said like in this idea of translating Kim Hyun's Glorio, do you think when he wrote these, he had a meaning to all of this? Because sometimes we write stuff and then, other people then infer or they project into what they want to see. I remember one time somebody told John Lennon that teachers were analyzing his lyrics, and so he went off and wrote "I Am the Walrus," which is just a bunch of garbage, and said, "Analyze that then, motherfucker." Like, there's nothing to it. Do you think Kim Hyun is working through something, or it's more sort of that kind of unconsciousness, that coming of age, dealing with those issues you were talking about?
I don't exactly know how he wrote it, but I would definitely say he probably didn't plan every single word, right? Like even as a writer, I write short stories. I can't see that happening. There are moments when you just put things randomly and like more visceral, things happening when you're writing, more like a stream of consciousness sometimes. So I think that definitely is there, but my job, of course, as a translator, is to think about how to translate these things in English, which actually you have to, even if the poem didn't have the meaning, you still have to think about the meaning because you're translating the meanings. So yeah, so probably I was like putting like meanings to the words. Kim Hyun didn't mean anything, but I think that's just a part of my job.
Absolutely, yeah. But I haven't read the Korean. I've only read the English. Can you give us some idea? And you'll say, well, it's just like the English, David. You've read the English, but can you give us some idea of the Korean Kim Hyun's poetry, Glory Hole, what it reads like, what it sounds like? Because you must have spent some time with it.
Yeah.
But rather than your translation, can you just give us perhaps a little bit of insight into that original Korean?
I try to keep like most of the like visceral feelings in the Korean original, but obviously Kim Hyun in the original work, he was being very playful with the words, a lot of puns and a lot of stylistic, twists that can happen in English, because of the syntactical differences and things like that. Yeah, you said when you watched the interview, Kim Hyun was a very humorous person, and I think that humor is there. It's like a dark humor. It's not like a bright humor, but it's there. And what else? Yeah, other than that, I think the Korean work. I think it's still very destructive. I had to read it so many times to understand what is going on. I didn't even have a gist of what was going on for some of the works, some of the poems. I just had to read like 5 times and then focus on this line and read it like 10 times, and then I get, oh, perhaps this is happening. So it's very convoluting, very playful.
I can't imagine how you did it, Suhyun, because I've spent some time trying to translate just to share public knowledge, Tae Yong Ho's book and some of Choguk's book, just privately, just to share with people. But I can't imagine what it's like to translate Glory Hole, because like you said, I've read some of these poems. I read it through twice. I read some of the poems and I just had no idea what it meant. I'm English, I'm reading it in English, but no idea. But I think maybe that's the point. So how you translated that, my word.
Yeah, I think that's the fun part of being a translator, like especially a poetry translator.
You worked with a co-translator on this, yeah?
Archana.
Archana, yeah. Can you just tell me something about Archer? What was it like working? Because it's kind of interesting, isn't it, Suhyun? Because you have one man, Kim Hyun, who you know, who's a real person, who's still alive, and then you've got two people bringing one person's work into a book. So that's like 3 voices going on there. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure, Archana is not Korean?
She's not. Yeah,
okay.
She's American.
Okay, she's American, yeah. So how does all that work? So you've got one voice into 2 into 1.
Right. So of course we try to make sure that we don't sound like 2 people when we're translating. So how I worked with her was basically what I did for the Napoliera as well. But we have a translator and somebody who reviews the translation and critiques translation, and then translator and the reviewer comes up with a better translation together. So I did for the 2/3 of the book I translated, and Archana chimed in and she made all of the comments, and we revised it together. And for the 1/3 she translated, and also the commentary, she translated the whole thing, and I went over it, and then I critiqued it, and we came up with a better translation, which worked really well because just by myself I don't think I could have gotten all of the things there in the Kim Hyun's poetry collection. Sometimes I didn't get the references, sometimes it's just, I think not even for the Glory Hole, but I think it's also always good to have 2 people working together and critiquing each other.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'll read through one of my columns before I send it to the newspaper 5 times, and then as soon as I've sent it, someone will say there's a mistake in there, and you can't see it. You're just blind to stuff. I don't know how it works. Does Kim Hyun speak any English, or was there any conversation with him during the process, or did he have any response once it was released? He was like, yeah, that's pretty good. I don't like what you did there, Suhyun. Or
no, he didn't. I don't think his English is that good. But I did ask him with some of the word choices because I couldn't figure out the meaning. You know, sometimes I had to ask him, "What do you mean here?" Like I really can't figure it out. And for one of the words, there were very few, but for one of the words, it was a word he just came up with. It's not in the dictionary. He's like, yeah, it's just a word I just created. I'm like, okay, I'm glad that I asked you because I don't think I can figure it out. But yeah, so except for those kind of moments where I needed him for my translation, he didn't really chime in. Yeah, he was just chill. And he always liked it when I told him on news, like, oh, the book is coming out and I'm having an interview with this, person. And, Kim Hyun is always excited.
That's great. Yeah, that's great that his work can transcend and be made available to other people. I guess let's talk about some of the words, because you mentioned that he was making up some words and things like this. And now, for those listeners of a more sensitive disposition, some of the words that he uses are rather kind of in your face. So one of the ones that stood out was sad vagina, I quite liked. And then you've mentioned it before, but in Korean, this idea of this 등등한 보지. These are very sort of graphical terms that you wouldn't necessarily say in front of your grandmother or something like that, or at least I wouldn't. But everyone has different. Everyone has different grandmothers. Yeah. But whether it's in English or whether it's in Korean, we're dealing with words really related to sexual organs, to sexual fluids, descriptions of genitals and carnal acts and things like this. I mean, are there any particular expressions that stood out to you? I mean, because when I heard sad vagina, I was like, oh, that should so be like an indie underground band or something like that. Maybe I'm thinking of vagina monologues and this kind of thing. Were there any expressions that stood out? Were there any ones that you were like, wow, this is kind of really some interesting language here?
Well, there were so many sexual expressions in Kim Hyun's poetry. So at some point I became numb. It's not surprising anymore. Yeah. So I think something that struck me is actually a line that's really clinical, like weirdly clinical. I brought it here. Let me see. Yeah, so the line goes, here the usage of the term is restricted to the act of heterosexual couple Gray and Bunny Smith, who, for the purposes of reproduction by means of sperm uniting with egg, inserted penis into vagina, and through mutual friction, resulted in instinctive ejaculation. So I think, this one was for me, it was the most striking line because 뚱뚱한 보지. At first, I'm like, ooh, that's a really strong word.
I said it to my wife and she looked at me.
Yeah. And then there's a line where the penis kind of dies and becomes blue and all those kind of things. Yeah. And so those were striking, but in the end I think when I think about a glory hole again, the one I remember the first is this line, that is exceedingly clinical. It's just so unusual to hear these kind of things in a clinical context. So, yeah.
I love the way you describe that, Suhyun, and I think this is perhaps really interesting because when I saw it was called Glory Hole and it was this collection of queer, I thought it was going to be kind of sexy. I don't know. But for those that haven't read it, it's not like a 50 Shades of Grey. It's not something that you read to get aroused. It's not something that you're going to worry, oh, I'm reading queer poetry and I'm aroused. Am I queer? That's not going on with this, actually. It's rather the opposite. It's actually it's using a lot of this sexual language, but making you step back and defamiliarize this clinical way you look at it. But it's the exact opposite of sexy.
Yeah, it's sobering. Like you're saying a dude, whose penis is going blue. Like, how can you feel sexy about it? So
I don't know.
Yeah, and exactly because Kim Hyun is defying any kind of imagery there is. He's like pulling things apart. It's definitely not sexy. You're not gonna get aroused. Yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. You read that really nice line about the penis and the automatic ejaculation and things like that. This was one of my favorite lines. I just want to read it while we're here. We won't do whole poems, but I suddenly don't know how to pronounce this name. Watanabe? Watanabe, is that right?
Yeah, Watanabe, yeah.
Watanabe, thank you. Watanabe, who was looking at his tongue in the mirror, opened the cabinet and took a dose of depression and daydream. And I love that, a dose of depression and daydream. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you take the red pill or do you take the blue pill? You take them both. That seems to be Kim Hyun's work, is this creative, is this destruction, the looking in the mirror and that constant self-reflection and expression, that psychological journey. It's really interesting stuff. Do we, just while we're staying on his work, do we read it? I mentioned like there's elements of William Burroughs and things like that. There's elements of Genet. Is that the right way to understand Kim Hyun and Glory Hole, or is that ethnocentrism and we should understand it more through a Korean lens? I mean, I'm just trying to give people that haven't read it like frames of reference and things. Are they the right frames, or should we understand it differently?
I think in the end, we should understand Kim Hyun through the lens of Korea and the context, of Korea.
Yeah.
I mean, it uses a lot of, American references, but that's also a reflection of Korea in the 1980s and 90s. So we should look that also through a Korean lens.
Yes.
But I think analogy always helps people to get interested in the work, like when they don't know anything about it. So I think like if somebody who knows nothing about Korean literature, nothing about Kim Hyun, but interested in like English poetry, I think that could be oh yeah, you should try it out, and then make some analogy. But other than that, I don't think it is helpful to like think about it in that term.
No, I completely agree. We should see Korea through Korea lens and Korean culture. There are a lot of Western references in the English version. In Kim Hyun's original, are they kind of, I mean, in terms of the names and things like that, it's not always like, Kim Hyun-dong said this, but there are lots of Western names and things like that. Are they Western names and titles and things in the original, or did you? Yes. Yes.
Yeah. A lot of them are transliteration. They were like a blowjob or glory hole. In Korean title, it is blowjob, glory hole.
Okay.
As well as a lot of names. Yeah. So that was the things I was a little bit worried about when I was translating. Obviously, like a translation, like literally, it is easy. It's just a transliteration, and it's an English word. But when you read a Korean work, because there are so many English words, it feels foreign. Like this entire poem feels like it's not Korean enough. It feels like it's from somewhere else. But since like most of the references are American and I translate it in English, it doesn't sound as foreign. Like it's not like the poem sounds foreign because because of its like a Koreanness, not because of its Americanness, right? So obviously there is no way I can like make Americans feel foreign about American references, but though I was conscious about like that kind of loss I'm gonna make in the translation.
I have noticed, I mean, I remember when I was big into Murakami Haruki and things like that, and that was all just full of Western references as well. And I think that was part of the appeal for people, that it was that kind of fusion. It was that fusion style between the two. Is there a Korean word for glory hole? That's a weird question, but...
No. It's just glory hole.
Yeah, it's just sometimes maybe.
But it's interesting that like in one of the in the commentary, which is not written by me or Archana, but it was included in the original Korean work, and the commentator starts out saying, when you hear the word glory hole, it sounds like you are in a wedding hall, like a glory hole.
It does in Korean.
Yeah, in Korean, because it is transliterated. It's glory hole, so yeah. It was so funny for me, but probably that person was being serious. But yeah.
Yeah, you can imagine some, nice old lady going up, oh, this is about wedding halls and things like
Yeah.
that. Pick this book up and then have a heart attack on page 6.
Yeah.
How does that work with you? I mean, because congratulations on bringing this book out, Suhyun. Like this is a cool thing to have done, because I can only imagine how much work it is, and the pressure and stress and the fear of failure and the imposter syndrome that all comes with people that write and work like this. It's real. So really congratulations on this. How does it feel if you ever go to I don't know, like family dinners or chuseok, or you meet somebody and say, oh yeah, I've released a book recently, and they say, oh, what is it? And you're like, well, here we go.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? What's going on there?
I think, unfortunately, I don't have any family member who has a fundamentalist, a religious view. So I don't have a problem with that. And honestly, I think older people, they are actually better with this, because they just think, oh, it's like a young people's thing. Right. It's just dump everything into that category. Young people do it, and just close the door, and that's the end of the argument. And
that's
also,
nice, dear.
yeah, right. Young people talk about more explicit things these days, and that's how they just understand it and they move on. And also there is artistic license, so I can just say, it's like a nude portrait in a museum. There are naked pictures and those kind of things. And poetry is literary art, so it's art. So I don't think my old aunts or uncles would have a problem with it, to be honest. But if I had a friend who is who think these things are sinful, then I think I would have a lot more trouble introducing this work to that person, because I'm doing something demonic. So yeah, but I haven't thought about that, because I don't have fundamentalist friends around me.
Sure. Let's flip that around then. Do you think the fact that it is queer poetry makes it more attractive in the current age? Because we're living, if it was perhaps say a poetry of Yobek or negative space and traditional hand, that people might be a little bit turned off by it because it's not contemporary, it's not modern Korea. Do you think the fact that it is, titled and sort of labeled as Korean queer poetry, that gives it a sense of newness and actually adds to the appeal of the work?
So can you repeat the question again, retroactive?
Okay, yeah, no, sorry. So the previous question I asked was, if you've translated Glory Hole and it has poems like Blowjob, it might be a bit difficult to say that to some family members or conservative, but you said no, it was okay.
Yeah.
From the other angle, because we live in a pretty progressive age these days, not just in Korea, but globally, because it's queer poetry, that might make it more attractive to people. If it was released 30, 40 years ago, it might be a bit like, but now people like queer poetry. Yes, let's promote that. We're good people.
Right. Yeah, I think, there's definitely that. Especially given that, a lot of people who are interested in arts and poetry, they tend to be, those who like to resist the traditional order. I think they get more interested in these minority voices that are not represented usually in the mainstream society. So I think people do get interested when they hear, oh, it's a queer poetry from Korea. I want to try that out.
No, I definitely agree with that. We artistic people like to be like that. Before we move on, Suhyun, is there anything else we need to say about Glory Hole or this work? Because you've spent so much time translating it. I just wonder whether we're doing it justice or if we're missing something. Or
I think we are doing it justice. Doing it justice, definitely. I asked a lot of questions, so I'm really glad. And if the listeners want to figure out more about it, they can read the book. So
And go buy the book. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to put the style there, this pitch there. Yeah, no, it's I'm really glad that I read through it twice, and because just the visuals of it, the dichotomy between this really, harsh language talking about genitals, but then the lack of sex, but then the visual image he always creates of people standing in mirrors, sitting on beds, old people performing oral sex, and all of this, but you can see it. And I don't know how that's actually achieved, because I think if I were to try to write one of his poems now, I wouldn't be able to create those visuals. So I think he definitely has a huge skill in that, Suhyun.
Yeah.
And so do you, having translated it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I think Kim Hyun is very talented, and we can obviously see from his careful placement of all of the imageries that, again, defies itself. He's just a genius, I think.
Do you know what he's doing next? Just before we go on to your literary work and translation, do you know what Kim Hyun's doing next, or what's going on with him now?
He has done a lot of things so far. I actually do not know what he's doing next, because I've been after translating this work, I've been focusing on my academics. So I'm taking a hiatus for a year or two.
Congratulations. Well, let's talk about this, because this fascinates me, because you've just been translating Kim Hyun's Glory Hole, but then, if I'm correct, your PhD at Princeton University is on Confucian philosophy.
It is.
These couldn't be more different. I mean, you've got Yugyo Sasang, you've got this focus on etiquette and the correct way of doing things, which seems so polar opposite to Kim Hyun's work.
Well, I'm really glad that you asked me this, because a lot of people, they are just wild but never ask me a question, and I'm like, let me give a chance, give me a chance to clarify that, and you did. So I'm really glad. I think so. It's important to distinguish the effects Confucianism had on the society and the Confucian philosophy itself. And I'm interested in the philosophy part. And of course, they are not two separate things, but you can still distinguish them. So, for example, let's say in Christianity, just because Eve came from the Adam's rib, and some people in the past, they thought, they justified misogyny with that. But we don't have to interpret it that way anymore. And a lot of Christian people, they don't interpret it that way. They think men and women are equal, and women do not necessarily have to obey men. So I think there is a difference between how it's interpreted, and then how it influences a society compared to the ideas themselves. And so my research, I'm specifically interested in Confucianism during Song, Ming, Qing, and Joseon dynasty. And these works, of course, they are still based on Confucian classics, but they also think a lot about human nature and what is moral principle, and where does it come from? Does it lie in our heart? Does it lie in is there a priori moral truth? Or is it embedded in the natural world? So there are a lot of debates and a lot of arguments, and that's how I got interested in Confucianism. There are actually good arguments that are very rigorous. And so as a philosopher, I hope to clarify those arguments and see if there are any logical gap, or if there is a gap, what is happening? Is there any other textual evidence I can use to supplement it? Or if I can't, why was this person making this kind of gap in the reasoning? So I'm probably digressing a lot, but Confucianism is it's a collection of diverse thoughts. which is based on the concept of rights, like rights as in ritual, not as in like human rights, but rituals and etiquette. I mean, Confucius was the person who internalized those rights by saying that, oh, there is humaneness. And then like Mencius, developed that argument to think about human nature. And, but thousands of years has passed since then. And there has been so many interesting ideas from Confucian tradition. And I don't think Confucianism can be reduced to, there are like a set of rules and etiquettes, right? And especially when we think about like how these arguments, although they have certain social contexts they were influenced by, like they thought about like a king and minister, but we don't think that we need kings and ministers to actually have a functioning society, right? So like in a different contemporary context, I think there's like so much possibility in Confucianism, how we can think about our moral relationship with other people, and how we relate to each other while rejecting the misogyny or other things that come from it.
You're immediately taking me back to my own graduate school days and Han Fei Zhu and the legalist school believing people are bad, and then Mengjiao or Mencius with the four roots, the natural beginnings of humanity, that we are good people, and if a child was falling into a well, we would immediately grasp to save it. One of the questions, go on, Suhyun. No, go on.
Oh yeah, and I just want to say that again, Neo-Confucianism, the period I focus on, it was the popular during the period when the literati and merchants, like wealthy people, were gaining more independence. Like they weren't like working for the government anymore, and they needed an ideology to think about the moral agency, like their like individual, how their individual self places in the moral world. So it's so there is like a robust discussion of like a self, not as in like it's mostly about like a moral self. So it's not like it's still like more like ethics or like meta ethics, but yeah, it's definitely different from what a lot of people think about Confucianism. It's just like obey the older people, obey the authority.
I mean, with the rise of the merchants and disrupting the four occupations of Hanong Gongsang, and one of the questions, I mean, I've read the Analects and a lot of the works, and I never come away feeling like I want to do bad or impinge or become a gonde or do gaptil to people. If I read the works, I feel very enlightened, and I feel very moral. One of the questions I always get, Suhyun, is what is Confucianism in Korea today? Does it still, I mean, people still give things with two hands, like Tusonoro and Beko, but this is what you talk about, rights, not the ethics. So that's the outward display of Confucianism. We still bow, we still use two hands. Is Confucianism as a philosophical ethic still alive in Korea today, or is it consigned to history and the Song and the Joseon that you're studying?
I think in academic field it is, still alive. There are like, Korean Confucian scholars like who study in philosophy departments. But of course, like academia is its own world, right? When we are talking about just a general public.
Can you see it at a coffee shop? Is it in like Tusum Place or something like that? Because that's how I think culture. I don't think like it's controversial. I don't think hanbok is Korean culture. I think it's history. Koreans don't wear it. I think culture is something lived and breathed and real.
Right. So the problem for me when I'm trying to answer this question is that it's really hard to tell if the, especially like, ideological or philosophical or like the abstract stuff, whether it's present in the society, it's really hard to tell because it's not like, external thing, you can just like detect and, oh yeah, it's there.
Right.
That's it. It really permeates, and then it's sometimes formless, and often it's entangled with a lot of different ideas. So you can't figure out which part of this thought is coming from, right? In let's say in conservatism, it could be coming from Confucianism, but these days it's merged with Christianity, as well as a lot of different ideas that come from everywhere. So it's really hard to pluck it out. It's just impossible to answer. But so I don't know how to say when I'm asked. So is Confucian philosophy still present among people? I don't know.
It's like trying to eat soup with a fork. Every time you pick it up, it drops away, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I study Confucian philosophy because philosophically they have a lot of interesting ideas. And
what's the most interesting one, Suhyun, of Confucian philosophy? Or what's an interesting idea in Confucian philosophy?
For me, the most interesting idea is the question of moral knowledge. So especially in Neo-Confucianism, the question is, they all thought that there is a moral principle, and it is people should live by those principles. But the question, of course, was how do you attain that knowledge? Who has that authority when you're attaining that knowledge? Who has the agency? Where does it come from? And depending on where you assign where those principles come from, the picture can drastically change, right? In one school they think the moral principle, it is in your heart, and you are the one who's affirming it, right? And while others, they think but if that is a moral subjectivism, there is a priori truth that is that is the structure of the universe, right? There is just there's spring and summer and autumn and winter. There is certain order of how people behave, and that is there is certain sense of what is moral, and you have to study how to be moral. But by studying it, some people might give more emphasis on book learning, but people can emphasize how you understand those books and principles, and if you're being sincere and all those kind of things. So yeah, I'm interested in the questions of the relationship between this concept of having a real moral principle, but how that is how that interacts with people, how people can obtain those knowledges. And I'm just fascinated when I see how it results in such a drastically different conclusions, depending on those kind of small changes you make.
Yeah. Are you a Confucian, Suhyun? I mean, you spend all that time reading it. If you spend all your time working on Nietzsche or Sartre or someone like that, you might eventually be called an existentialist or something like that. So are you a Confucianist? Do you think it's affected you, this study?
I think it did affect me, when I was studying, although I wouldn't call myself Confucian, yeah, but I do think when I see myself, I'm embedded in the society, and I am the choices I make, decisions I make, they affect other people. And so when I make a decision, I try to be conscious about it. So for example, zero waste, those things. For me, it is inconvenience for me. When you are trying to buy something, I often have to go to several different places to see if there's a better product. And I also try not to buy things on Amazon, and actually try to go to a store and shop to reduce carbon footage. Anyway, so so when I think about how my behavior affects other people, I also think about if I can sacrifice something, I do. And if I feel like, it's just I don't have to like sacrifice a huge part of me. If it's just like a little inconvenience, then I'll go for it, because I'm living with other people. It's not just me, who's living in this world. But of course, there are certain things that are really important, and I would not sacrifice, like, how, who I love, how I identify myself, and those kind of things. It's like a more, it's not like, Confucian kind of like a reasoning, but I try to like, see, if something outweighs, the other, and then try to balance things. So yeah, in that way, I think, I've been influenced by Confucianism because before, I don't, I don't know if I was directly like influenced by Confucianism. It's like a changes I had like as I studied Confucianism more and more, but there could be other influences too. But yeah, definitely before then, like, I was more about just like a me. So yeah.
Whereas Confucianism, one of the big values in that is ren, or in, or that human heartedness, which is the value between two people sometimes,
Right.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and also like, sorry, yeah, another important concept is songcheng in Chinese. It's like a sincerity. So, when I make a decision, I always think about if I'm really sincere, because like even if like the results turns out to be bad, if I'm really sincere, I don't think I'm gonna have a regret. I made the choice, I could make, at that moment, and that is actually one of the Confucian's teachings, in Confucianism. It's not about the results, it's not about whether a gentleman doesn't act because he's gonna, get a good result from it. He's acting sincerely, and by doing that, he's acting in a good way. So the sincerity matters a lot to me.
Yeah, and that's a really nice idea. One that I often tell a lot of my undergrads and things when they come for sangdams, or they're not sure to go to graduate school, or do this, or stay in Korea, or go home, or whatever they might be thinking about. I always tell them, Suhyun, yeah, but you've got a choice. And there's no perfect choice, and that's what a choice is. If it was obvious, it wouldn't be a choice. You would just do that. But you must acknowledge and appreciate the luck you have to be able to make a choice between these things. So whatever you choose, that's your choice, and like you say, do it sincerely is a really cool thing. One of my big things about, you said that there are some values that you wouldn't give up, but some that you will make sacrifices, especially related to green behavior. Man, I think paper straws suck, man. I just need to say that. Like, why do I have to drink a paper straw when you've got all that plastic? Like, just give me a straw. Paper straws suck. One of the things that I try to have difficulty conveying to people that just come to Korea, and I'm not sure if this is what you think Confucianism is, but in the United Kingdom or other parts of Europe, we kind of treat each other as equals, and we use each other's names, and we shake hands, and we do all this. But in Korea, I'm immediately cognizant, now I've been here nearly 20 years, of the Gaechung, of where I am in this setting, right? Oh, that person's the oldest, then me, and then me. So I'm never saying their names. I'm never really speaking back to them, but I'm above those people. And that's not how I would naturally act. I would treat everybody the same, whether this person's 50, this person's 30. We're just people, right? Yeah. But I find this conflict in Korea, because to do well in Korea, you have to acknowledge that thing. Is that Confucianism? Is that a moral system?
Right. I think it's like as I said, like a lot of values, they get entangled in a society, so it's really hard to pull them apart. I think the sense of that, they're. So in Confucianism, we call it 정명. It's the acting according to the name, right? It's like, the king should be a king, and the father should be a father, and the son should be a son. So I think, that could be a huge influence. But I still do not think that, like, just distinguishing people, like, I'm a year older, you are a year younger. Like, I'm like, somebody higher. I'm your Hyun, I'm your, I don't think that is Confucian thing. I mean, there also like, 본데, like, how older people like want the younger people to just follow them and, not to speak up against them. I don't think that is Confucian either. I mean, when you think about the debate between Gi-dae-seung and Lee-hwang, like Gi-dae-seung was new person, like, he was like really young, and Lee-hwang was like a grandmaster at that point. And Gi-dae-seung is like writing letters after letters, like criticizing his points, and Lee-hwang comes back with like his arguments, and none of them says like, hey, why are you talking back at me? It's not like that. So when they say Jongmyeong, like, acting according to the name, I think it's something we can really agree these days too. Like teachers should be teachers, right? And we don't, we can't, and by that, like, I'm not saying like teachers should be teachers, students should be students, so students should wear, like, I don't know, certain things, and they should act in a certain way. I don't think, I'm not trying to prescribe certain behaviors to it, but I think, there are generally things we think of, well, what good teachers should be, caring, and trying to teach students in a sincere way, and students, they should be interested in learning and those kind of things. I think we can easily agree that those things matter, and in that way, teachers should act according to their names, and students should act according to their names. But of course, it's really easy to distort this concept and just like abuse it in a way. It is abused in certain social circumstances in Korea. But I don't think that is the problem of Confucianism, but like, the problem of people who abuse it, and we should push that back. Yeah.
I completely agree with you on that, because I think sometimes Confucianism gets a bad rap, and people say it's the cause for everything bad, or it's the cause of kaptil or gondes or right. those kind of things.
It's like an old view, like, since like late 1800s, right? Like when East Asia, like China and Korea, encountered the West and figured out, oh, we are so behind. What's the cause? It's because of Confucianism. And they weren't like entirely wrong. Again, like, Confucianism is not just philosophy, but also the, how the social system and the structure. And when they were trying to make the transition, a lot of literati, a lot of like people who are learned in the traditional ways, they were the status quo, and they were trying to go against it. But I think, but I gotta say, there were also like Confucian, like like Park Eun-sik, who was influenced by Wang Yangming, the Confucianism, who used Confucianism to fight against imperialism and things like that. So like Confucianism, again, the idea is like pretty fluid, but yeah, there was that social system. So I think it wasn't like entirely, they weren't like entirely groundless, but it's that the ideas we had then, it's still here, right? It's like somehow people are still subscribing to that idea that Confucianism is old. In like Chinese would use like Fengjian, like it's feudal. Like Confucianism is feudal. It's like dragging us like into that like a feudal system. And I think it's an error they make because they do not distinguish the idea and then the social like institution that was hosting Confucianism in the past.
And so Confucianism is not just one thing, but there'll be some, I mean, you mentioned Park Eun-sik, there's also Lee Hang-no and all the various people at the time that would have had different interpretations of it, some conservative, some progressive, some for embracing modernity, some against it, and these would have been because of their own positions in the world. How do we, this might be controversial, you might not have an opinion on this, but the Joseon dynasty, for example, this had a slave population of about 40%, some people would say at the time. So, and I've always found it interesting, this question of, does it matter whether you enslave your own people or enslave people of a different ethnicity or from abroad?
Yeah.
Because that's a big conversation in other parts of the world, but Korean people were enslaving themselves, so it's okay. I don't know, but that was the Gabo reforms of 1894 make that illegal. But how do you look at Confucianism and slavery? Because that's the Yangban, that's the Jungin, that's the Nobi or the Noye.
Confucianism was definitely elitist. I gotta accept that, because the knowledge production in the past, it happened among elites. You know, like people, like just ordinary people, like farmers, not just like slaves, but like most people didn't know how to read classical Chinese.
Right.
Like, you know, so and because the Confucianism was often studied by the elites, Literati, and you know, those people, it definitely has that elite color, right? The character. But I think you have to, again, look at it from the social context, right? Like, you know, even for slavery in the United States, I think there is a difference between people who like actively endorse slavery, right? And people who was conditioned by that like a social circumstance, so they still had like slaves, but still like, you know, they would give them like, you know, not like a farm job, but like, you know, working in the, you know, in the house and, you know, things like that. I'm not like, you know, saying that was okay, that's totally wrong, but still, I think, you know, those people had like a different reasonings when they were choosing those kind of actions.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, when you think about Confucianism, we should think about it that way too. You know, slavery was like it was taken for granted, and if they could like go against it, that's phenomenal. You're like a revolutionary, but not like very few people are revolutionary. They are like used to like what they are born into. So to answer your question, I think Confucianism definitely had that elitist color, but there were Confucians who were critical about discriminating minorities. Like, you know, Li Zhi from Ming Dynasty, he was like all for women's rights. Actually, he actually had women like disciples in his in his lecture hall, and he got detained for like, you know, accepting women students. And people were thinking, you know, he's having a improper affairs, like adultery. That was not the case, but you know, but there were people like that, and there was that like, you know, possibility of Confucianism being developed in that direction, right? So so I think like, you know, you should put everything into context, and also Confucianism, like, you know, Mengzi, like mentions, there is that like a sense of 혁명, right? Like a revolution. Confucians often see history as a cycle, not a, you know, like a one-line progress. There's gonna be a revolution, and you start, and then you know, and everything goes down, and then people like you know, they do a like a revolution again, and then it goes up. So like Confucians, they weren't like denying all possibilities of having revolutions. They were not like denying all possibilities of like people who just a general people rising up against the ruler. It was just like a really restrictive, like the ruler had to be in a really bad shape. Like it's not like, you know, like in a contemporary society where people can just voice up whenever they want, right? So it's like a little different, but I think, you know, Confucians saying that like a tying Confucianism and slavery together would be a little bit unfair. Although I do acknowledge that there was that elitist component in Confucianism. And again, like there were so many different like Confucians going in different directions, and that's another factor.
Yeah, I think these days some of the trends is to anachronistically project our modern values into the past and then condemn people for not And the danger with that is what happens in 20 years where we're being completely moral by today's standards, then we might be immoral by the future standards. That might be eating meat. That might be things we do, buying from Jeff Bezos or things like that, you know, as you've said with Amazon. But it's really fascinating. I wasn't expecting this Confucianism conversation, but I can see that you like it a lot. And I want to ask you this question about it: the Confucianism in Korea, and that of course changed over time with the arrival of Neo-Confucianism and the fall of China. That's different from Chinese Confucianism, though. I think Korean Confucianism, and I'd like your opinion on that, seems a lot more strict in terms of, you've talked about this rectification of names, the people having their roles, power distances between teacher and students, also between men and women with bubu yubyol, putting the women into like anbangs and separating them, covering them. Some of my Chinese students will call me David. My Korean students would never call me David. Not the ones that have been lived and raised in Korea. If they're international, they might throw out a David, but most of the time it's 교수님, professor. But with my Chinese students, I notice amongst them that they feel less of a power distance. And the female students are a bit more outspoken. That's only anecdotal evidence, but is the Korean Confucianism different from the Chinese one? It's stricter, it's more hierarchical, more patriarchal.
Right. I think like my answer is yes and no.
True academic.
Yeah, just like evading hard questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I said no because like I think a lot of those hierarchical stuff is like, you know, more modern stuff, like, you know, influenced by Japan as well, right? Like, you know, and militarism during the, like, you know, Park Chung-hee's era and those kind of things, you know, more uptight and, you know, those orders, you know. So I think there are definitely, like, you know, factors that are not Confucian. But I also think, you know, Korean Confucianism was stricter. And when you think about it, I think I'm thinking about in the context of like a Ming Dynasty and, you know, Joseon Dynasty, you know, the era when there was an overlap. So in Ming Dynasty, what became popular was the focus on the heart, right? You know, so they went into the Wang Yangming's direction, and of course, even within that faction, their views differed. But like it's some extreme ones, like really extreme ones, like a Li, those people were like, you know, hey, actually human desire, even the desire to eat, desire to have a sex, that is like a nature, you know, and it is totally fine to like act according to that nature. You know, it's in your heart, and that brought a, like, you know, romanticism in literature and, you know, art, not brought, but like they coexisted, you know, they coexisted in Ming Dynasty. Whereas in Joseon Dynasty, Yangming studies didn't develop that much. It was shut down by Yi Huang, you know, when it's, you know, first entered. It was considered too Buddhist, you know, like, because Buddhists, they're like, you know, they sound subjective as well. So like, you know, oh, they are like, you know, they don't believe in like any objective value that is like not Confucian, that is like Buddhist. So just discard them. And also a difference is that in Korean, like a Joseon Confucianism, I think more people were I'm just trying not to use like, you know, specialist term, like, you know, in the direction of the key-based studies. So ki here is like, you know, the material energy that circulates in the world. You know, it's like
어떤 기? Sorry. So gi is energy. Yeah, gi.
Yeah.
It's like Star Wars: The Force or something, isn't it?
Oh yeah, gi. Ki, chi. But it's not like how we use chi or gi these days. Like, you're not like, you know, some kind of mysterious energy in our body, but it's more like, you know, what composes the external world. It's like the leaf falls, and then like there's winter, and then there's like a bud. Those are all the like a circulation of gi. So that there were more people who are gi minded than like shin minded, heart minded, and when you're like in believing that gi matters, the objective world, external world matters, you're not gonna accept subjectivism. You're gonna think about more about the external world, and how those things work, and there is an order in those things, and you have to follow that. And how are you gonna follow that? You're gonna exert your efforts to like conform to those like natural orders, and so those kind of thoughts were more popular in Korea, whereas in China, Shin-based like a philosophy was more developing than like in Korea. But that is like that also has like a good things too, right? Like I think in Korean Confucian philosophy, the arguments they make are a lot more organized, and they are more systematic. And you can see that kind of influence. You have like the gi-based influence in their like writing style as well. Like it's really much easier to follow. If you're not like trained in a Confucian philosophy, you're still gonna see that there's an argument in Korean philosophy. And also
that would have been written in traditional Chinese, though, wouldn't it? I guess, but still,
written in traditional Chinese. But it's like oh, I disagree with your like this, and the first reason, second reason, like that kind of organization. It's very organized, and they are very trying to be exacting. Like they don't really want much like a mysticism in the concept. Really trying to clarify like what this word is. So I think it had like upsides and like a downsides with any kind of thinking.
It's of course it's obvious, but the idea that the conversations were taking place between objective truths and subjective truths, subjective realities, and the key-based one where it's about the external world and those systems, rather than the more like the Maum ones, the Buddhist influenced ones. And I'm pretty sure that anybody listening to this for queer poetry is already turned off. But but nevertheless, we're still here. How does that tie in? How does queer culture tie into Confucianism? Does it at all? Is there a place for it, even in like the Maum based one? So you were talking about opposite of the gi one. Is there room for that, or we're projecting into the past something that wasn't there? I only ask because they're the two things we've talked about thus far. I'm just asking if there's an overlap. There might not be, but I'm just curious.
I usually deal with these things as like it's two separate things, so I don't really think a lot about like whether there is an overlap or not. But I think you could develop an idea in a way that there would be an overlap. I don't think there was like an explicit discussion about sexuality in a way we do. They talked about the Confucians acknowledged that sexual desire is good when it is between like husband and a wife in a proper relationship, because reproduction matters. So they talked about it in those contexts, but they didn't really talk about hey, sexuality, let's just talk about it. So they didn't go into that direction. But I think with any kind of thought or ideas, you don't have to stay in the past, right? You don't have to like get restricted in the past and then just like think about how those ideas influence the societies back then. If the ideas are interesting, and if it makes an interesting contribution to the contemporary discourses, it can be brought into that this contemporary discourses. And I don't know in what respect Confucianism is going to be able to do it, or if it is going to be able to do it. I have no conclusion. I prefer not to have conclusion first before I do the more work. But yeah, I think that is a possible direction.
And sometimes I think, Suhyun, that we only look for work, or we only look for ideas, sorry, that are perfect. No ideas are perfect. Even if you're looking at Plato, if you're looking at Hume, or if you're looking at Lao Tzu. Actually, I think Lao Tzu's work is pretty perfect. Actually, in Taoism, I was always a Taoist. But we sometimes focus on the things that it gets wrong when they might have lots of positive things to add, because nothing's perfect, right? It might have something. When we talked about poetry, we talked about Kim Hyun and Hwang In-tan as contemporary Korean poets. Like, you seem to have a very deep philosophical bent, which I now see in you more. What philosophers in Korean or Chinese should we be reading in the modern day? Or do you only stay in the old days? I mean, is there interesting philosophy going on in Korea in Korean? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I was told by the analytic philosophers here that there are a lot of interesting analytic philosophy like discussion going on in Korea.
Yeah.
But I'm not familiar with them, so I cannot talk about it. There are like Koreans who were active in the United States, like Jae Kim, who was a phenomenal philosopher, but he wrote in English. And I think the area I know is like a Korean philosophers who write about Korean philosophy, from the past. And there definitely are a lot of interesting works. There was this is a little bit dated actually. It was in like a not early, but mid 2000s, I think. But there was a huge debate among like Korean philosophers who do Korean philosophy in Korea, how to understand Yulgok Yi's epistemology, 지각설, like how he understands what is understanding. So it was like a series of debates that lasted for like 6 years on a academic journal. There are like so many academics, like philosophers, jumping into the argument and just the discussion going on and on and on. And so there are a lot of exciting things happening in Korean philosophy as well.
I'll have to look out. Somebody recommended me a book. I can't remember the author's name. It was Cholak and Cholak. Kang Shinju. Anyway, I'll find it later. But what I do notice, it's a trivial point, what I do notice is that although there's sometimes entertainment shows, Suhyun, there's still a lot of professors and people on like mainstream television talking about history and morals and philosophers. You don't really see much of that on British television anymore or Western television, but I do still see that here in Korea.
Which is like I feel a little bit hopeful about. I am also worried about the fall of humanities in not just Korean academia, but academia everywhere. But I think Korean academia it's even worse, to be honest, because students have to choose their major when they enter university. It's not like they don't have time to explore humanities, and they often do not choose humanities because they want to get a job. In the United States, at least, we choose majors after we enter, and there is no restriction, so we just explore. And a lot of students take English major, philosophy major. Sometimes they do it with STEM field as well. So it's like there are students who want to study humanities, but that doesn't seem to be a case in Korea. But I see a lot of grassroots humanities programs at a local library. There was also I attended a program in Daegu. That's like my hometown where I live. It's an organization for grassroots humanities, but retired professors would teach a course for a semester. It's a very affordable, and you go there and you sit around, and people people are from everywhere. Like some are retired police officers, some are just a next door old woman who's just housekeeping, but she likes to take these humanities courses when she has time. So people get together and they talk about you know, 정약용, they talk about Plato, they talk about Kant, you know, those things are still alive in Korea, as well as at the local library. There are so many humanities lectures and people actually go there, as well as the TV shows you mentioned. So yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic than a lot of people.
And you're the next generation. What happens when you finish your PhD at Princeton in all of this?
Who knows?
But do you have an idea? Do you have a vision? Will you be in Daegu speaking to the housewives about Lee Hang-no and Lee Sang, or will you be somewhere else? Is there an idea?
I really have no idea at this point. I can see myself in the United States, and you know, I like being in the United States. But it's also nice to be, you know, near my family, and you know, that's an upside. So at this point, I'm just trying to focus on my research and, you know, doing it well instead of like thinking about where I want to go.
Sure.
I don't have that much like options for mobility anyway. So
you do what you can. Yeah, I know it very well. Good luck with your research. It's the historian David Fields gave me some advice when I was doing my PhD dissertation, and he said, David, there's two types of PhD dissertations: good ones and finished ones.
Okay.
So I just got the finished one done. It's like, just get it finished, because you know, you always want to make things perfect. But shall we perhaps move on to this, and I'll pronounce it wrong, Nabilera.
Yeah.
Pronunciation.
Yeah, that is right. That is right.
Really?
Yeah.
Nabilera.
Nabilera. Yeah.
And so Nabilera is a what is Nabilera? You describe it to us. It's a contemporary literature translation, Suhyun?
Yeah, it is. It's a literary journal I started actually when I was an undergraduate student. So yeah, I picked up I've always liked the creative writing. And when I entered university, I just started to keep a blog called Untranslation, and I just translated a lot of poems. And I translated a lot of famous poems, you know, usually in like a Korean textbook. And surprisingly, I got so many visitors, basically every day. It's like from everywhere. So I felt like I gotta do something more ambitious than, you know, just a blog.
Yeah.
And so I thought, if I want to do something seriously, then I want to feature, you know, somebody more exciting. I think people who are alive are more exciting than people who are dead for the people who are alive, right? You know, so I decided to feature somebody young, somebody underrepresented. So cool. I gathered some of the translators and started that. And and another influence I had was I was at a bookstore in Harvard Square, and you know, I was going through the literary journals, and I saw a literary journal called Monkey Business. I think they go by Monkey Magazine now. It's a contemporary Japanese literature journal. They say like a contemporary new Japanese literature. So when I saw it, I was like, they are doing basically the same thing, you know, like the same idea, right? Like featuring new literature from Japan, but I can do it for Korea. And I felt like, you know, if they do it, I can do it. So I started the magazine. Yeah.
Does the magazine have a print version, or is it online only? No, it's just
online only, because I didn't have resources to do that.
Yeah.
The money is the problem.
It's a very cool thing, and I knew about Nabilera before I approached you for this podcast, and I didn't realize the two things were connected. So it's a real kind of tebak moment. Nabilera seems pretty progressive, Suhyun. So when I looked at the various things, like you talked about with Kim Hyun's poetry, collections of poetry don't have themes. Journals often do. And Nabilera's themes over the years have included feminism, mental health, the LGBT community, which is where I guess Kim Hyun comes in, and anal realism, which was a new word for me. It seems pretty progressive. What's the motivation behind those themes? Is it just to give a voice to the underrepresented, or is there something bigger driving than that, or it's just, hey, it's catchy and that's what we were doing at the time?
I think the first reason you said, you know, trying to give voice to the underrepresented. Korean people like gay writers. I mean, they are like all famous, so they're not underrepresented, but the voices there that are underrepresented. Because like Hallyu is going so strong, and but the web K dramas and those kind of things, they're usually about straight love and those kind of things. And I also thought a lot of people would be interested in it. So yeah, a little bit of the third part. That is not the only reason, obviously. I don't do it just because it's catchy. But
Yeah,
I
right.
think a lot of people are curious about it. A lot of people would read it. So that was my motivation.
There's a lot of good people. As soon as I posted up on the Deconstructed Insta that I was talking to you, Beth Eunhee Hong got a hold of me.
Oh yeah.
She was very excited to hear about that. But you mentioned Hallyu, Suhyun, the dramas, certain dramas. Like I was watching a bit of, what's it called? Haebang Ilji? Was it My Liberation Notes? And there's some dramas that are really popular in Korea but that don't sort of go overseas. Recently, the literature's doing really well, isn't it? Like Bor Chung's work, Anton Her seems to be crushing it. Do you have any observation on the place of Korean literature and poetry and translation in this wider Hallyu sphere? Because everyone knows BTS and everyone knows Squid Game, but where does literature, translation, poetry, your work with this fit into that?
Well, I think K-pop or those dramas, movies, those are like sourced by big companies often, like except for like independent movies, but those are usually not like accessible to like a lot of people like abroad. So like I'm talking about mainstream like media. I think those are like a good stepping stone for people who are interested in Korean society. They love Korean songs. They love like these shows that are on Netflix. They're accessible, but not all do. But a lot of people, I think, as they watch those things, they get more curious about the culture itself, right? Not the ones represented by not the ones produced by the big companies and in a like a more regimented way, right?
Yeah.
Like the K-pop idols, like they train in a company and they dance a certain move, but something more organic. And I think literature definitely provides that. It's not done by a big company. It is the individual writers like writing novels, poetry, and all those kind of stuff. And they all have different voices. They all have different experiences. So it's really when you are looking at literature, you can actually see the dimensions of Korean society. And I think literature definitely is more accessible way to learn about Korean society than like a article in a sociological journal.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a lot of people find literature as a means to do that kind of thing.
And because to write, you don't need a lot, right? You need a pen and paper, you need time. Time is the hard thing for those of us in the economic system. But, the female voices in Korean literature, they're driving it at the moment. They're winning, whether it's Hangang, whether it's Kim Ji-young, Parisi Binyan saying, the queer poetry and literature that we've talked about today. And I think it's really interesting because it gives them a voice. It gives them a chance to talk because they don't need other support other than themselves. And so, you do get that reality. Is there, Suhyun, in translation and in this kind of work, is there anything that ever gets lost? And what I'm going to talk to you just very briefly about here is things like Han, Nunchi, Dong, Kapjil, Gonde. Are these explicitly Korean things that non-Koreans can never understand in translation? Or are they just words like kamja that just means potato but just in a different thing? I don't know why I'm hungry, but do you see what the question I'm asking here?
Yeah.
Are there certain Korean concepts that are literally untranslatable to the non-Korean reader and speaker, or are they just Korean words for a universal concept that we all kind of know, perhaps different in degree, but not different in kind?
Right. I think the answer is a little bit complicated because this I'm talking about like poetry translation, not a like in a novel. But the gist of it, like my answer is that I think there are, of course, you are losing a lot in translation, but not those things, not those like cultural stuff. Like I think those are translatable. It's like nunchi, like we have like a gauge like other people's like emotions at some point in our lives. Kapjil, we have like heard about or like experienced people who are in authority trying like harassing people like with their power. I think all those concepts, I don't think they are uniquely Korean. I mean, like, how those kapjil happen, or like, where you need nunchi, those kind of contexts might be more like, Korean. There might be the Korean context where you have to do those things and how those things happen. But I think, there is that universal experience where, we feel harassed by somebody who's powerful.
What about
or,
Han,
we feel
then?
Han, I think yeah, as well as Jung. I don't know, like, I think everyone has Jung. I mean, like when you go to countryside, it doesn't matter which country, which country you're from. I mean, I saw like what is that? Like Sweden these days, they are very controversial. Maybe they don't have Jung. Just kidding.
Oh, they're not eating at the houses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think those things are translatable, and these things are especially translatable if you are translating prose, right? Like you can give a situational like a clues you can give, and like in prose the length of a line doesn't really matter. You can like add like more descriptions there too. As long as it doesn't make the novel like an entirely different thing, right? Like with kapjil, like I think you can't use like a one word, but you can use like 5 words, like 6 words to like do that. And I said it's complicated in poetry translation because you can't do that, right? Like in poetry translation, lines matter, and the rhythm, right? Like there is that hoop, like where the breath ends and starts, and those kind of things matter. So you have to be concise if the original poem is concise, and so the linguistic things really matter. But I think mostly, I think those things still can be translated. But I said you always lose something in translation. I'm like more thinking about the linguistic challenges than like those like is kapjil like just the Korean stuff or not.
Yeah, no, and especially with poetry, with rhyme schemes and stanzas, lengths, all of that, syllables, absolutely, and that's why I think you did a fantastic job translating the glory hole. Well done on that. I think, Suhyun, are we missing anything before we come to the last question? Is there anything else that you want to add about Confucianism, blowjobs, poetry?
I don't think I have any. We talked a lot.
It's been great. I've really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it because we went in places I wasn't expecting, and I like that.
Yeah. I'm glad that we talked about it because you're the first person who talks about literature who would listen to me talking about Confucianism. So, yeah.
I spent years studying Confucianism. I'm glad to have done it, right?
Yeah.
Let's thank you so much for your time. Let's go to the last question. This is a question that I do ask everyone. Despite none of us requesting the pleasure of it, Suhyun, we are all on this planet together. Now, while we are here, is there anything that we can do to find meaning in our existence? Can we do something to increase the value of other people's lives? Suhyun, what is the meaning of life?
I got this question like yesterday, and I was like, wow, what should I even say?
Seriously, David? Yeah.
So I don't know the meaning of life, but I try to find meanings in little things that I do that compose my life together, and through those things I try to gain meanings in life. but I don't know, like, I haven't found an ultimate meaning of life that can unlock like all the mysteries in my life. So I don't know the meaning of life. So like, little things I do, for example, like, research I do, literature I translate, songs I sing, workouts I do, like, I play kendo these days. So like, those things have meaning, like, those things have meaning to me, why I'm doing this. And, it also shapes how I interact with other people, right? So I try to find meanings in those kind of things. And yeah, just let it be there. And I think, I guess,
what songs do you sing, Suhyun? What music are
um,
you into? I've no idea. I can't imagine. What music do you listen
okay,
to?
I'm pretty much into like everything. I listen to everything, and like if starting from like classical to like classic rock, and just like pops and basically everything. I don't really listen to a lot of K-pops, but I still listen to like K-pops I used to listen before I moved to the United States. So that's I still listen to those, and all those kind of things.
What have you
Yeah,
been
but I
listening to
still
this week? What have you been listening to or singing this week?
I've been listening to Billy Joel, like
Oh
Piano
yeah,
Man and those kind of things,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and some of the 21, the Korean Korean girl group.
Mm. They were at
Yeah,
Coachella recently, weren't they?
mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, but yeah, that's what I listen to. I also listen to like a lot of you know as I said, like classic rocks. Like I used to listen to it like on a radio when I was like teenager. Like radio sounds like old, but
Mm.
um, but I still like that randomness of radio. Like yeah.
Yeah,
And then like if I like the song, I try to like write down the song because they tell you the name of the song, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, those kind of things. Yeah.
I'm old enough that I used to sit by the radio with my finger on the cassette player with play and record, and you would have to
Uh,
wait till they played your song, and then you would record it. But
uh,
you would have it, but it was like coming up next on Radio One, and that's how we
right.
used to get music, man. You used to have to sit and wait for the bloody thing. It was hard.
That's so funny. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there an objective truth? You said that you find your little sohwak-hengs, which is a
Mhm.
Murakami term, I think, those small but definite pleasures in your singing and your kendo.
Mhm.
Is there an ultimate truth? And I only ask because you were talking about that gi-oriented and Maum-oriented aspects of Confucianism. So
Mhm.
even though you might not know it, is there one out there? Is there a meaning? Is there a truth?
Um, that's a really hard question. Um, well, when I was an undergraduate, I probably said, "Oh, hell no," like I'm all the way in
Yeah.
like to the deconstruction camp. But I'm not in that camp anymore. But one thing I definitely know is that it's really hard to find truth. It's really hard to find what is the reason, right?
Mm.
But I think there is such thing as the reason, a way to think reasonably. But there can be like so many ways, you can go with the reasoning. But there, I think like a more like a procedurally, there is like a more accurate methods, more like exacting methods you have to take. But I don't think that translates into me thinking that there is that substantive like a truth. There is the truth. Just
Mm.
live it. So yeah. But I don't know, to be honest.
But it avoids slipping into nihilism and thinking everything's the same. There are certain procedures or journeys that are more
Right.
valuable and more worthwhile, perhaps more appropriate and
Yeah.
efficient than others.
I think logic matters, right? Like there is logical truth, and but things get very complicated because there are so many premises in our daily lives and like things that happen in the world,
Mm.
and that's why it seems like oh, logic doesn't matter. But I think there is like a certain thought, like a thinking structure that helps you think clearly, and those things really matter.
Does it get easier with age, the clear thinking?
I'm too young to answer that.
How old are you, Suhyun? This is a nice conversation because we got all this way without asking. So I guess you're like late 20s, mid to late 20s?
Yeah, late 20s.
Yeah, okay.
28, and not in Korean age. Yeah. In Korean age, I'm 29.
29.
Yeah.
They're changing that. The president's changing that.
Yeah.
He said.
You can try, but people still use pyong. I still use pyong because like in the United States we go by like a square feet, and like I'm not used to square meter, so like in Korea I would just go by pyong. I don't know like what square meter is.
Yeah. I'm sure I'll go back to a pub in England one day and ask for a pint of cc or something like that.
Yeah.
I've been here that long. Suhyun, this was amazing. It was a conversation that I wasn't expecting, but I loved every minute of it. Thank you for your time.
Same here. It was really fun. And
Cool.
Thanks for inviting me.
Excellent.
Yeah, and let's keep in touch.
Deconstructed.